Welcome to the FBC Midlothian podcast. We hope today's message will speak to your heart and draw you closer to God. To find out more, visit us on the web at www.fbcmidlothian.org.
We're glad you're here today, and today is a really significant day. We want to make sure we honor your visit with us, and we'd love to have a chance to know you and serve you. I'm going to ask you to do us a favor. If you're a guest of ours today, the program has a tear-off section that has a couple of things on it. It's a place to put contact information, a place for you to submit prayer requests, a place for you to declare your testimony of some things that are going on that you would praise God for. It's a tool for you to use. And if you would like to do that, I could do that in stereo. If you'd like to do that, we'd love to have that from you and have a chance to serve you. If you don't mind, when the offering plate comes at the end of the service, if you'd put that in the offering plate, we'd like to have a chance to serve you in the days ahead. Today is a day we now know as a part of our vocabulary. You say the word 9/11, that term, that date, and every single one of us are transported back 10 years into a particular day, a particular set of circumstances, memories that many of us will never lose. A day when our hearts were broken, a day when we saw courage that was unimaginable, and tragedy that was the stuff of nightmares. It's been 10 years, and all week long, really for the last month, we've been kind of building up to this time, and people have remembered, and we've had to revisit images that haunt us. But today, I also want to remind you that in the midst of all that loss, we also saw tremendous courage. And it reminds me that there are times when things are happening around us, and we stop believing God is at work. We wonder if He's still aware, if He's listening, if He's watching. Today is the first day the choir is back to lead us in worship after taking summer off. And they've been preparing a song to try to minister our hearts today as we remember both the tragedy and we remember that even in those days, even in that pain, He is still God and He is still at work.
I wait and be still, knowing You're in control. Restlessness, leave this heart that's held strong in its weakness. Fearless Father, You come to my rescue. You are my fortress. You are my friend. God, You are God even when I don't feel You. God, You are God even when I don't see You. I knowing you're in control.
It's been a decade now. A decade of war, a decade of questions, a decade of memories, a decade of watching God at work, even in our pain. And it's important that we remember. It's not just my idea. It's not just a nationalistic idea. It's not something that came down the pipeline and said, hey, this would be a good idea for today. It's something that's biblical. And I want you to see God's purpose in it. If you have your Bibles this morning, I want you to turn to the book of Joshua today. And I want you to see the choices that we're going to have to make, the opportunities we have today, even as we remember. We looked at this passage about 6 years ago together. This is Joshua chapter 4, at a time when we were in a different place, a different era as a church family. Started looking back at all the things that have happened in the past, and all this summer we were looking at Moses' life. And we're looking at how that people went through a transition, went through all kinds of changes and turmoil and struggle and victory and defeat. Moses led them out of Egypt into freedom. And over God intervened for them on their behalf. He acted in their midst. He continued to walk with them at times when they were rebellious, at times when they caused all kinds of problems for themselves and for him. Moses leads them all the way until they get to the very edge of the promised land, and his time has come to an end. And he hands the baton off to a man named Joshua. A Joshua whose every description in the Old Testament proclaims faithfulness, loyalty. And Joshua begins his responsibility to lead the people from that point, and they're right at the cusp of the promised land. They've been on a journey that's lasted for over 40 years. They are right at the edge of what has been promised to their forefathers, has been promised now to them, and they're getting ready to enter that time. And Joshua was given instructions by God, which he then passed on to the people. The priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, this gold-covered box that was sacred because God made it that way. And he said, this will be the symbol of my presence among you, and you will keep it in the tabernacle, and someday you'll keep it in the temple, but this will be the picture of my throne in your midst, and I will be in your midst. And so it was not to be touched by human hands. They carried it with poles that went through rings that were on the side of it. Only the priests were authorized to carry it. And so they were walking toward the river Jordan. And God gives the instructions through Joshua that the priests are to walk into the water. And only when they're ankle deep in this flowing river does that river stop flowing. Now, if you read anything about history and about that region and its topography, you'll find that that river was often blocked off by landslides or by cliffs falling and caving into the water, stopping the flow of water. And I've heard all kinds of ways that people have had to describe how this all happened. But they have never been able to explain why it happened, when it happened, as long as it happened. When the ankles of the priests were deep in the water carrying the covenant, the water stopped and it began to dry. And this multitude walked across on dry land to the other side of the river. And Joshua gave these instructions that as they went through this river, they were to pick up stones from the riverbed and take them with them. And so as they walked up the far side, the far bank, the leaders of the tribes each carried large stones from the riverbed that they would keep and they would use later. Now, all week long, we've been reading and seeing memorials. Yesterday, they had a dedication of the memorial in Pennsylvania for the flight in which the 40-some-odd passengers overtook power and led to the crashing of that before it reached its target. All day today, there will be memorials and services and times where they'll read off names of people who were lost in the 9/11 attacks. There'll be all kinds of things, but that's not just in Washington. It's not just in New York. It's also here in Dallas. It's also here in Texas. And this week, the Dallas Morning News, Scott Parks, wrote about that phenomenon. He said, since 9/11, people across Dallas-Fort Worth have created memorials that can be seen and touched. Much like a simple headstone, we believe these monuments prevent a tragic event from fading into foggy memory, or even worse, evaporating altogether. So over and over, you hear the same comments from those who create the monuments. Quote, we must remember. It's a place to go to, a quiet place to reflect. It brings closure. And we show people up there in New York that people down here in Texas are with them. Like pieces of steel girders, like blood-stained flags, like markers in an empty field. Joshua instructs the people to take those stones from the riverbed and pile them up at a town called Gilgal. This is why. Joshua 4, verse 20 said, Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their fathers, what do these stones mean? Tell them. Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Israel was a forgetful nation. Generation after generation, they were forgetful. They would go through some kind of tragedy or they'd go through some kind of deliverance, and their memory was only as good as a few moments. They suffered from what I would call community-wide amnesia. It wasn't good enough that God had just done something. In the moment, they could fly off the handle in every other direction and forget what had happened. They forgot the lessons. They would forsake God instead of choosing to remember and honor Him. Joshua knew this. God knew this. And so they built a reminder, a memorial, just a simple pile of rocks. What's the rock for, Dad? Well, I want to tell you. And it was there so that they would be able to tell their children and their children's children. And frankly, that's why we do those memorials. It's why we take days like today. It's why we create holy days and holidays in our calendar, because we do not want to forget. We want to remember the way that things have happened. We want to remember both the good and the bad. We want to remember how God has been faithful. And we want to be able to pass that down to our children and our children's children for generations to come. It's too important to forget. "10 years ago, do you know where you were? You remember who you were with? You remember how you felt? Do you remember what you prayed? Do you remember how you looked toward the future that day? It changed us. It did. 10 years ago. The last 10 years have been full of changes. I used to fly quite a bit, and to this day now, every time I get on a plane, I'm aware. I look around. What are my surroundings? Where are the exits? What would I have to do? And there is a different kind of courage on airline travelers today that was never even a thought 10 years ago. I've been thinking about that, but I've also been thinking about the rest of life, because frankly, we haven't all been swooped up in that. Some of us have brothers or sisters or cousins or nephews or nieces or uncles that are in the military and they've gone off to war and come back. Some of us have had to alter our lifestyles. I used to be one of those guys like Northcutt who would rush onto the plane and they'd close the door behind me, and I'd only gotten to the airport 5 minutes earlier. In fact, it was sort of a game for me. How close can I cut it where the door is still open right as I rush on the plane, hand my bags up into the case, and they close the door and start moving the plane? I always loved being the last one on. It was 20 miles to the airport. I left 25 minutes before my flight. It was wonderful. No longer. That's gone. And we'll probably never see that again. But I started thinking about the last 10 years for you, for us. And today I want to choose to remember God's faithfulness, even in difficult times. 10 years ago, this church was pastorless. 10 years ago, probably the majority of you weren't even here. Let's just see. 10 years ago, how many of you were here in Midlothian attending this fellowship of faith? How many? Crazy, isn't it? A lot can happen in 10 years. 10 years ago, in this town, all of life and every schedule was defined by a crossing at 9th Street for the trains. You remember that? Any of you here when we had no bridge over on the parkway, and every way to get to the church or get virtually anywhere you would be stopped, and you had a great built-in excuse. "Mom, I'm late." "Yeah, I got caught by the train." "I heard that train go by an hour ago." "Well, it was a really long train." We dealt with a completely different culture. Our schools felt rural 10 years ago. Many of you didn't even live here. The neighborhoods where you live now did not exist 10 years ago. Things have changed. 8 years ago, I was a brand new pastor here, and I lost my mother on the 3rd day of my job. And I experienced this family in a very strange way as the pastor having to be pastored. 8 years ago, 7 years ago, I remember we had to make a huge decision as a church family. We had reached the point where we had 2 services that were both full, and we were doing blended worship, and the traditional crowd hated the contemporary music, and the contemporary crowd hated the traditional music, and we were going at each other. And so we launched a 3rd service. But even then, we were wondering, okay, how do we deal with all these students? Because we had so many high school and junior high students, we realized we could not fit all of those students and their parents in a single place that we owned. There was not one room that would hold them all. And so we did heresy. We separated them. And I had people say, Pastor, that's the end of the church. And we lived through it. We made adjustments. Sometimes they were hard. 60 years ago today, we were packing. We were packing. Those of us who are here were packing to move to this place. A decade ago, someone had walked into a situation, a conversation where there was a lady who was liquidating her family estate, and she had some acreage right near Mount Zion Road. It's just a bunch of scrub trees and a little dry creek bed, and that was about it. And she was liquidating it, and they had talked about the 287 bypass for over a decade, and everybody said it'll never happen. But one guy in our church heard that, perked his ears and said, if I give you $10,000 check right now, will you hold this land until I get back? Yeah. And he came to our church and said, there are 43 acres right where the future is going to be. And we're landlocked and we have no place and the parking lot's filling up and all those things. We need to think about the future. And we got this land for a song. A sacrificial song, but a song. So 6 years ago we were packing up because someone, before most of you were here, had vision for your faceless lives. And they made sacrifices to make it possible. I love that. We packed up and we moved and we opened our doors, and that day we said goodbye to an old era of our church family and we started a new one. And many of you were the result. You were who we prayed for even then, before we knew you. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've had to say goodbye to people that we have treasured. Some of them in their 90s, some of them in their 20s. We've had days where we've had to hold on to each other because we had broken shoulders. We grieved with each other. There have been days when we've celebrated incredible opportunities and incredible changes. Over the last 10 years, many of us have had a chance to invite friends and watch them take that slow and steady but certain journey toward Jesus, the Christ, finally saying, I believe He is the Son of God, and I've chosen to trust Him with my life and follow Him for the rest of my life. We've had lots of days at Scott Furtick's pool or at the Northcutt's pool or out at Hobletzel when we gathered around and we'd see a couple of dozen people wade in those waters, tell their story, and we baptized them as new believers. For some of you, that was your children. For some of you, that was your spouses. For some of you, those were your parents. There have been days when we wondered, how in the world are we going to make this work? Days when tragedy gripped our town. Days when we filled this place with people weeping because someone had died, and our church kind of put our arms around them as they did so. Been great days, fun days to watch, days to see marriages that had no hope of survival, but through a lot of prayer and a lot of confrontation, a lot of support, we watched many of those that looked hopeless experience what I call the miraculous. And others that did not make it, who had people like the Houstons or like Ben put their arms around and say, we will hold on to you while you grieve and while you heal. There are a few of you in this room that weren't even alive 10 years ago. And we've watched y'all. I happen to have seen a bunch of you naked. I've seen you in diapers. I've watched your mommies cry as they introduced me to you. We've walked together through some difficult days, some great days. And it occurs to me that in the midst of all this tough stuff, whether it's the national stuff we've seen or the things that we've experienced as a family together here in the last decade, in the midst of all the best and the worst, one thing was clear: God was still at work. There were days when our choir would sing and something tingled because you'd been touched. Days when a testimony was shared and you thought, that's me. And God did beyond what any of us could have prepared for or planned. And there have been days when things happened and we just did not understand. I've learned that it really is a choice what you see. That in this thanks, just as it was centuries ago, it was a choice of whether you would remember just the pain or remember the good. If you would remember only the tragedy or you'd remember the courage. And so today, as we remember those from 10 years ago, as we remember our own history as a family that's walked through those changed times, I want to ask you to make it personal and ask yourself, will you remember just the pain, or will you choose to also remember God at work and His faithfulness to you? It really is a choice. I keep thinking of FDNY. Never knew what those initials meant. The New York Fire Department. I keep remembering those helmets and how many waded into those burning towers and how many were left to pick up the pieces when it was over, grieving and struggling, honoring, serving when they were broken themselves. I want to remember the courage. I want to remember the ways that God acted and moved and healed. What about you? I was with a woman when she said goodbye to her mom. Her mom was stricken with cancer and had been in a long battle. She was old, but in her heyday, she was vivacious and she was a woman with a mission. She knew everybody. She was a floating butterfly that loved touching and knowing and being juiced and jazzed by people. But on this day, she had been on hospice for 3 weeks. They'd kept her comfortable, and if any of you have been through this, you can relate to it, that there are moments in the midst of the fog of the pain medication and everything else where suddenly they become lucid, and it's like, what just happened here? And I watched that lady's eyes open, and she turned to her daughter, who was already standing by her bedside. And the daughter was caught off guard. And, Mama? And that woman took her hand, and she said, I love you, honey. You have your flaws and your struggles, but you have gifts and strengths. And I am proud that I got to be your mom. And she was asleep again. And those would be her final words. Out in the hallway, this daughter was devastated. She stood there, and I was her pastor, and she said, Bruce, my mother thinks nothing more of me than I'm flawed and broken. And I said, were you in the room with me a while ago? I thought that was you. That's not what I heard. I heard the same words. That's not what I heard. Your mother said she loved you, and she said you're human and that you bring great strengths and gifts to the table. And she is proud to be your mama. And I said, Kate, you have a choice. You can either hear the blessing that she was trying to give you, or you can hear the curse you fear. It's a choice. Today, friends, we have a choice. We can either just grieve, or we can also face that grief with hope and with the certainty that God is still at work. Taking His hand and say, God, whether I can see you or not, whether I can feel you or not, whether I like it or not, whether I understand this or not, I will trust you. And I will follow you. In a private moment, I could name you some folks I've seen do that. I could talk about people that I've seen do that. You know, every once in a while people will say to me, Bruce, your church is a large family. There are a bunch of hypocrites. There are people who are fakes there. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Some days when I stand up before them, I feel a little bit like one myself. So they're in good company. But if you want to know what the real deal is, I can point you to them. And I defy you to tell me they're fakes. They're real. They're human. They make their mistakes. They sin. But they're real honest about it. And they're real repentant about it. And they take one day at a time trying to follow the Jesus who saved, not because of all their great works and qualities, but saved because of His great love. It's a choice. So I ask you today, will you remember only the pain? Or will you make a choice of faith to see and remember His faithfulness to you? Blessing or curse, joy or sorrow, and in the midst of that, He is still Creator, and we are and always will be creature. Creature, beloved. Would you pray with me? Father, sometimes when I look up into the stars, I understand what David was talking about when he wrote the psalm about the glory of the heavens and the majesty that you possess. He asked a question I've often wondered myself. Who am I? What is any man or woman that you, in all that grandeur, would pay attention to us, even acknowledge us? God, the fact that you continue to intervene into our world, to reach into our hearts, to seek us out, to call us by name, to give your tender mercies to our hearts, to issue your comfort. God, that you do that at all is beyond me. But when I have seen it often and I miss it and have taken it for granted and tough days come, I realize we have no hope but you. Oh God, in the midst of our grief today that we share with the whole nation, in the grief that our community has inherited because of the loss of one of our high school students this weekend, in the midst of trying to wrestle with all that stuff, God, we ask you to give us courage to trust you even when we can't see you. That you give us eyes of faith to see where you're at work. And that this too, you will redeem. God, I ask you to bless those families who today are remembering the loved one who did not come home. In the process, Lord, I pray that your name will be proclaimed, that your peace will be so thick it's unmistakable. And God, I pray you'll give us courage and vision to see the future you have yet for us to live. A future full of challenge and opportunity and joy and its share of sorrow. And in all that, God, give us the grace to trust you. For that I ask, not on the merit of my own soul or any goodness we bring, only on the merit of Jesus the Christ, who gave his life for ours. We ask that in his name. Amen.
Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. To find out more, visit us at www.fbcmidlothian.org. FBC Midlothian, where we're transforming our community one changed life at a time.